Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's session entitled Leveraging and Power CDS Calculations to Assure Data Integrity in Your Chromatography Laboratory. Today's session is sponsored by Astrix Technology Group. Next slide, please. Before we get into the content and the presentation materials, I want to first take a moment and introduce you to Astrix Technology Group. If you've not joined us for one of our webinars in the past, you're in for a treat. The content is always great and educational, and we're glad to have you. We want to tell you a little bit about the company and who we are before we get into the presentations. We are first and foremost an informatics professional services and strategic outsourced solutions company dedicated to servicing the life science community. We were established in 1995. The company is privately held. It originated within the IT division of a company called APBI, which at the time was a $300 million life science research organization. Today we operate from 7 offices in the United States and Costa Rica with our headquarters in beautiful Red Bank, New Jersey. Who we help as companies are Fortune 1000 life science enterprise, chemical, CPG, government research institutions, companies with large and fast-growing IT, outsource and compliance needs. The mission of the company has and always will be to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions for the scientific community. Now, as far as the group that we're talking to today, we're talking to the professional services group of Astrix Technology Group. And you can go to the next slide, please. And this group is responsible for scientific data systems. We are the group that delivers the end-to-end services that span the complete life cycle of all scientific data systems in a laboratory. This includes everything from the beginning part of these projects, which is the business process analysis and the enterprise architecture. This is where Astrix is often hired to come in and help design an architecture of laboratory informatics technology and software. And then once we do that, we often participate in the actual selection of the vendors and those different software applications. We work with a wide array of informatics vendors across a wide array of application types, which you're going to hear from one of them today in Waters. So we help to make sure that the solutions that you're choosing are the right solutions based on the size and based on the makeup or any individual requirements that you may have. And then from there, we help with the development and the implementation, and finally, on the back end of that, the computer systems validation work. There's also the ability for us to help you manage these systems after the fact for our 360-degree laboratory system services. And then if required, we even have the capability to staff both scientific and technical resources in your organizations to help everything from the scientific side of the fence to the maintenance, management, and running of these actual applications. Okay. With that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next phase, and that's introducing our speakers today. So we're always grateful to have Rena Nunez and Marcelo Suarez with us. So just to do a little quick introduction, Rena is a lab informatics manager here at Astrix Technology Group. He works in the informatics professional services division. His focus is on CDS and SDMS practice of the company. He brings over 18 years of experience in lab informatics, and during his career has worked on over 30 Empower enterprise deployments, as well as New Genesis, SDMS, and LIMS implementations. Marcelo is a senior informatics engineer here at Astrix Technology Group, and he brings over 14 years of experience in lab informatics and analytical instrumentation. With the scope of work ranges from implementation to training to support, third-party system control with Empower CDS, selection processes, systems best practices, and creation of custom calculations. So, certainly we've got 2 very good minds with us in today's presentation. I want to go ahead and introduce Marcelo. I think you're going to kick us off, and I'll sit back and enjoy the presentation.
Great, thank you. So this is in the beginning, right?
Yes. So this is one of our last few webinars this year, and we decided to talk about chromatography-related calculations. So why do we feel this topic is important? Well, chromatography is one of the most important analytical techniques for many companies out there, and it can represent a huge amount of the workload in the lab. So this means that the CDS, in our case here today, Empower, will typically generate large amounts of data. Transcribing all that information to an external system can present huge risks from data integrity perspective. Data integrity is a major concern in the regulated industry and is also a critical part for the FDA's mission to ensure safety and quality of the products on the market. So today we're covering these topics here. What is data integrity? So we will explore what's the definition of data integrity and how that impacts calculation practices. General considerations for calculations and scope of chromatographic calculations. So we will define what are the characteristics for robust and compliant calculations, and we will identify which calculations should be done in the CDS and which ones should be avoided. How to make sure the calculations are doing what they are meant to do. So we will identify some of the pieces that you need to put in place to create evidence that they are doing what you expect. Benefits of having all chromatography-related calculations in Empower, and why you should avoid using external applications for CDS-related calculations. So we will talk about why CDS itself is often the best location for these calculations, and what are the things you need to pay attention in case you need to do them externally. So next slide, please. So to start off, what is data integrity? So as per FDA, data integrity refers to the completeness, consistency, and accuracy of data. Complete, consistent, and accurate data should be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. So these 5 words together will form the famous acronym ALCOA. And what all those words mean? So attributable means that the data generated or collected must be traceable back to the individual who generated information. Legible, that the data recorded must be readable and permanent. Contemporaneous means that the results or measurements must be recorded at the time the work is being performed. Original means that the data points to where it was originally observed. And accurate, that data recorded must be complete, consistent, truthful, and represent the facts. So the acronym ALCOA was then expanded to ALCOA Plus, which added 4 more concepts to the original idea, and you can see them highlighted in yellow here in this slide. So complete, meaning that the information that is critical to recreating and understanding a particular event is present. So this would include any repeat, retest, or reanalysis that were performed. Consistent, that the data are presented, recorded, dated, and timestamped in the expected sequence. Enduring, data must be maintained intact and accessible throughout the life cycle. And finally, available, that the data or information must be able to be accessed at any time during the defined lifetime of the period of the record. So next slide, please. So general considerations for calculations. So having the data integrity concepts in mind, we will discuss how Empower can help you address data integrity concerns associated with human interaction with data. And we'll show you how deep Empower can deliver calculations in a controlled environment. So it's worthwhile for us to start the discussion by defining the characteristics of calculations to be performed in a robust and compliant manner. So 1, the calculations must be accurately reflect the true reality of the test. 2, the calculations and any eventual changes, either before or during the result calculations, must be documented and available for review at all times. 3, ideally, the calculated values should not be seen by the analyst until it has been recorded in permanent medium. So this principle here is to prevent users to pick and choose what inputs will generate the result that fit their needs. 4, after in any initial calculation, history of changes made to factors, dilutions, and weights using in the calculation must be preserved in an audit trail. So for example, you're calculating an assay and you get a result of 200%. So you stop for a moment, you review our inputs, and you see that you had an incorrect dilution factor entered in the system. So you would have to change that dilution factor, right? So the system should be able to capture and preserve these changes you made along the way. And lastly, all factors and values used in the calculation must be traceable from the original observations to the final reportable results. We will discuss where else chromatography-related calculations could potentially be done moments later in the presentation, but no matter where they're happening, it must always be possible for you to see the original data and original outcome. In addition, there must be transparency, so changes made to values are along the way are easily captured for review. Okay. So next slide, Marcelo. So scope of chromatographic calculations. So the obvious things that will come to mind when talking about chromatography-related calculation are the calculation of the actual reportable results from the run. So let's say amount, percent impurity, total impurity, label claim, dissolution results, and also calculation of any system suitability test parameters. An example of this would be percent recovery, bracketing standard agreement, retention time differences between multiple replicates, etc. The overall best approach is to keep all chromatography-related calculations in Empower, and ideally, we should try to focus on only having calculations that will generate numeric values built in Empower. We will expand on some of the reasons for this in a moment. Next slide, Marcelo. So Empower is able to handle multiple calculation requirements with all functionalities, but in several occasions, additional custom fields are required. And this is really one of the things that make Empower so special, right? It's flexibility. So custom fields are fields that you can create in Empower that are either input fields or calculations, and they allow the users to input minimal data. So let's say recovery factors, secondary standard dilutions, label claim, and so on, and then receive an output of a calculated result using Empower database values. So here we have an example of calculation requirement that Empower would not be able to satisfy using default functionality. So a custom field was created. In this case here, it's a ratio between the average area and the standard weight of two different standard preparations. So I'm sure many of you can relate to this requirement that this calculation is very common to assure good standard preparation, and the result to be expected here is around 100%. Next slide, Marcel. So exactly because Empower tools for calculations are so powerful, after many users start getting knowledge of the system and understanding its capabilities, they tend to start getting creative. So one classic representation of this creativity is to use Empower custom fields to do specification assessments, such as pass or fail. Look at this example here on the screen. So if the numeric outcome of a calculation, percent agreement here in this case, falls within the range of 98.0 to 102.0, Empower will translate the assessment to pass. If it falls outside this range, it will translate to fail. In our situation here, the result was 100.8, and we see that the assessment translated that to pass. There's nothing wrong with having this calculation in Empower. It looks beautiful, I understand, but it's important to remember what's really the most important thing to get out of your Empower calculations, and what's the level of effort you need to put in to achieve this, right? So even though it's perfectly possible to build these calculations in Empower, we're seeing right there in the screen, right? There are systems more suitable for this particular task, such as a LIMS, for example. So chromatography is just one of the many techniques you will find in a typical lab. So that means that other instruments are being managed outside of Empower. So the system that controls these other instruments could potentially not have the same tools as Empower. So you would need to have a separate system to do this final specification evaluation anyways. So my point here is that you could be putting in too much time and effort into something that will not solve all your problems. Don't forget, whenever you start creating calculations or fields in Empower to satisfy requirements, somehow you will need to create evidence that those are doing what they expected to do. And with that, I'll hand it over to Marcelo.
Okay, thanks, Anna. So now that we've seen that Empower has lots of functionalities and lots of possibilities for calculations, so having data integrity in mind, how can we make sure that whatever calculations I created are doing what they were meant to do and that I capture enough evidence of that? So key questions to think about this. So does the formula that I created meet my method requirements? Is the output of this calculation reporting the corrected value? If this is supposed to give me 100%, is it doing like this? Is it agreeing to certain decimal places numbers? Or how should I test it to make sure that it is doing what I mean it to do? So a couple of things you need to have in mind to make sure that your calculations are doing what they were meant to do, having data integrity in mind. So first of them, create an SOP. So having procedures set in place is the best way to guarantee your consistency during your development, review, and validation and maintenance of your formulas. So before you start adding any customized calculations within Empower, first you need to set a proper environment for that to happen. So creating one or maybe multiple SOPs is the best way to start, as it guarantees not only a proper life cycle of developed calculations, but also sets the Empower current environment in terms of user permissions and data organization before you start. So some things that can be answered while you're building your SOP for that process. How many testing environments must be used? Should I have, let's say, a dev server, a prod server, a validation server? If I don't have the resources or bandwidth for that, I can do all in one server, but I have to make sure that data is separated so I don't accidentally tamper with production data while doing development work. So those are things that while you're building your SOP, you can figure it out. So another thing, Which permissions should a user have to develop custom calculations without compromising data integrity? Let's say, for example, report methods. You want to make sure that whatever you create a report method, you have the proper level of documentation to make sure that this works correctly, and only for the designed use of that and for the users who need to control that. Another thing, how to operate with data exported from external systems. Some labs already have Empower, and they can start building customized calculations based on SOPs. Other labs are coming from different CDS systems to Empower. Let's say OpenLab or Chromeleon or any other CDS in the market. So they do not have any injections on their newly installed Empower. So they will probably need to export data from those outside systems to Empower to work with developing calculations. So this can be accounted as well as part of your preparation and the SOP for that operation. Another point in mind, what is the required level of document approvals? Should I get approvals from QC, QA? Who should sign and who should be accountable for those documentation? And last but not least, what are the expected deliverables for each new calculation development? Should I capture screenshots? Should I get manual calculations? How many documents should I have as sound evidence of this development and testing of custom fields? So about that, create and collect solid documentation. So the best way to document customized calculation development is to separate development efforts into smaller sets of documents. So instead of doing one huge validation of all calculations within Empower, you break that into small sets of work so it gets manageable. So one of the best ways we've been doing for other projects that we've been working with is separating that into test methods. So for each test method in your laboratory, there is a small set of formulas and calculations that go with that. So you break that into small sections for test methods, and you do small cycles of validation. You create a protocol, validate for that test method, approve that, and you move forward, So it gets easier to manage that. The objective of these sets of documents is to demonstrate that proposed customized calculations execute exactly the way the analytical test method requires your analysis to be calculated. So some of these documentations that you need to create and collect as part of your calculation effort are, but they're not limited to, let's say, for example, a work instruction. You are creating a new calculations in Empower. So people need to operate the system in a certain way so calculations can produce the same results for every analyst. So it's good to have, for example, work instruction created to assist the lab users on how to operate Empower in a consistent manner, producing consistent results. Another document that is very helpful when you're working with leveraging Empower calculations is a calculation design specification. You have to think that not everybody knows how to create customized calculations within Empower. There's a kind of a learning curve to do that, but you have to at least let people know what a formula is supposed to do. So a calculation design specification is a good document, for example, a sound document that shows people what a determined formula is designed to do, what is the outcomes that come from that formula. So even if the person does not know how to create custom fields themselves, they don't know how to read the formula written in the documentation, they know what to expect from that formula, and they know what needs to be checked if the formula does that or not. So it's good to help reviewers understand what customized formulas are developed for and what are their expected outcomes. Another thing that you need to make sure that your calculations are doing what they were supposed to do is having a solid testing strategy. So visualizing what your testing plan is, visualizing what your testing plan is before you implement the formulas is key to fully understand how to proceed with your testing. So take as an example, this formula here in this slide. This is the exact same formula that Henan showed a couple of slides back. This formula is supposed to give you pass if your values are between 98% and 102, or fail if it's outside of that range. So thinking about a testing strategy for this formula, how would you test this to make sure that this is working? And how to document that? So by looking at this formula, what are the possible outcomes from this? From looking at this, we can see at least 5 outcomes. Values that are below 98, between 98 and 102, above 102%, and values that are exactly 98.0 and 102.0. So those are the possible outcomes of this formula. And I need to make sure that the formula is working for all of those guys. So this is what a testing strategy is, figuring out what is supposed to be done with this formula, and then figuring out how you're going to test this and document this. So what is a way of testing that this formula is working? This is using the recovery calculation right there, the percent agreement, and this is using area and sample weight, for example. You could, one way of testing this would be changing the sample weights so the calculated value falls within all those 5 conditions. So that means you would need to process sample sets multiple times to get the values to reflect what you're trying to test. Another way to do this would be having multiple sample sets with values that fall within those situations, but that can be a little bit difficult to achieve the 98.0 exact value or 102.0. So this is a second way of doing this, a little bit more difficult to achieve. But if you sit down first, build your testing strategy up front, understand that on paper, it's the best way to figure out how to deal and how should you document that. So how to document that in this case, as this is just a pass and fail formula, one way of doing this would be screenshots capturing the value reported in the percent agreement calculation and the percent agreement assessment right beside it, showing the pass and fail under that condition. Another thing to make sure that your formulas are doing what they were supposed to do, one key topic to work during validation of customized calculations is the option to leverage previously validated fields and formulas. So if allowed by the approved SOP you built upfront, any customized fields and calculations validated in previous protocols can potentially be reused in multiple projects. What does that mean? Let's say, for example, let's take one formula that is known by everybody, like a percent over label claim. You have your calculated value divided by the expected value times 100. Basically, almost all laboratories have some kind of formula like that. And this is pretty much repeatable on multiple methods. So one way you could address this is you validate it once at the first time this formula appears, get all your manual calculations, check if it works, if it meets what the method expects, document that validation. So when you get to a second test method that also uses the same formula, instead of revalidating everything again, you can have your SME on your lab reviewing that calculation to make sure that it accommodates to whatever is needed for that method, making sure that it is still applicable under the new premise of the new method. So then you don't need to revalidate everything over again. You're still asking for someone to look at that for you and making sure that this is still working, but you don't have all the effort of revalidating everything over again. So you gain momentum and you make your validation effort much faster with that. Another thing to make sure that your calculations are doing what they're meant to do, follow change control processes. So when a test method or procedure that have associated custom fields is changed after validation, I'm not just talking about the formulas, but let's say the analytical method changed by some reason, and that changes the limits of your test or the way you should calculate things. Now you not only need to pay attention on what you need to change on your methods, but also on the calculations that are created on Empower. So as part of this change control process, an impact assessment must be performed within a change control to verify if any changes to calculations on your method might impose required changes on the formulas as well. So once you put calculations on Empower, it is a live system. So it is prone to changes as time goes by. So you need to address these as a live system, as you should. So with that said, with all this work and all these things that I need to do to make sure that calculations are good and doing what they were supposed to do under a data integrity perspective. So why is it good for me? What are the benefits of having all chromatography related calculations within Empower CDS? What do I gain from that? Okay. So one of the benefits is to decrease the number of incorrect results due to typos, poor system integration, or intentional change. So think about this. Today in your lab, how many interactions and manipulations your analysts have with your chromatography data from the moment the injection is done at the chromatographic system up until the moment you have the final reportable value? How many steps does your analyst have to get from the original data, transcribing that into an Excel spreadsheet, or making calculations on a form, or making hand calculations on a scientific calculator, and then transcribing that all back to your LIMS or SAP? How many steps does it need for you to take from the chromatographic system up to the final reportable value? That may vary from company to company, but if today you don't have any related calculations on Empower, chances are you are using one or maybe a combination of electronic spreadsheets, paper-based forms, calculators, etc. So even though it's not forbidden to use such tools, one must agree that the number of human interactions and by extension human errors can and will be much higher when compared to a fully automated option. When we're talking about systems in general, human error is top one source of issues with typos or such things. So investing your time and efforts to embed your calculations within Empower not only addresses data integrity concerns, but can also help your lab gaining productivity based on the additional points mentioned in the slides we'll have right after that. So another benefit of having all chromatography related calculations within Empower is centralized data for easier review processes. So one other question to think about. So Brennan mentioned in the Alcoa definition that data must be original. So let's give an example. So let's say you're going under a FDA validation right now, and you're asked to provide all original data related to a specific analysis. So think about your environment. How many data repositories would you need to dig into to find the data you need to provide to the auditor? Would it be possible for you today to provide it in its completeness and in a timely manner? Would you need to look for paper-based things that are stored somewhere else, or would they be readily available for you? So centralizing all chromatography-related calculations in Empower not only helps you have original data in a searchable, readily available location, but also speeds up routine review process. So tools like result ID trails and electronic signatures help your workflow happen much faster for this. So this brings to the other point, which is reduced review lifecycle. So as you already have tools like result ID trail and electronic signatures, so that shortens your lifecycle between signatures and approval of batches. It happens in a much faster way in electronic, allowing you to focus on priority tasks. So instead of transcribing data over and over again to multiple spreadsheets just to get you the final recovery calculation or percent over label claim, you use that time that you will be typing data on another system to focus on next analysis. So you gain productivity based on that. You have, of course, an overhead of developing the customized calculations, but once you're done with that, you gain that time back on your laboratory. So, but not everything is achievable on a CDS. Lots of things are, but the other side of the story is that there are calculations that are difficult to perform directly in Empower or any other chromatography system, especially those ones that have data spread across multiple months or multiple sample sets. Let's say statistics across multiple sample sets, or stability studies that sometimes sit on different projects, or data very far apart from each other, trend graphics. So these kinds of things, they are not impossible, but difficult to meet on Empower and very effort consuming to build. So in these situations, often a spreadsheet is used to perform these calculations, for example. But there are other alternatives to CDS, right? So one of them, for example, is a LIMS or an ELN system. So LIMS and ELN applications, if configured correctly, generally will have an audit trail capability for most analysts' actions, and have the capability to perform calculations that are problematic for chromatographic applications, such as mentioned before, multi-sample set calculations. And calculations like these are usually where a LIMS platform will shine, really. So that's the good part. On a negative note, the ability to interface these types of systems could create data integrity weaknesses that you need to make sure you address in terms of data integrity. So to name one example, let's say you have to send data from Empower out to one of those systems, and for some reason you have to rely on flat files like a TXT file or a CSV file. If not properly configured, those data can be accessed and manipulated externally using applications as simple as a notepad or a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, and then sent back to the LIMS or ELN for calculation. So you need to be vigilant and create mechanisms and evidence that this scenario can't happen. You cannot have, for example, a TXT or CSV shared folder sitting on your network with no security set to it, with any kind of user going into that and making edits to files on that folder. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another scenario, weak scenario for LIMS and ELN, is when you are manually transcribing information from one system to another. Let's say you do not have automated integration between them, so you have to actually print the results and type in on the other one. So anytime a human manages a numeric value, there's a risk that digits in that number will be transposed in a small percent of transactions due to typos or something like that. So that's one thing to have in mind. Third point to consider is that a LIMS or ELN can perform calculations such as linear regression for standard curves. You could do that on a LIMS system, but a lot more work is required to set up calculations in a LIMS or ELN versus the chromatography system. So even though the LIMS or ELN is more flexible, the chromatography system is better suited for a process it performs routinely. So bottom line, if you are using a LIMS or ELN system to cover some of these calculations, both systems are fit for certain purposes. So for chromatography calculations, nothing better than a chromatographic data system to deal with those. So like creating calibration curves or making amounts or corrected amounts. This is routine analysis for a chromatography system. So nothing better than leaving the chromatography system to deal with chromatography data. And then additional things like trends or something like that, or evaluation of requirements, pass and fail, those are easily achievable on a LIMS system. So the bottom line here is trying to keep each system with what they are designed to do, what they are fit to for purpose, right? So another option, we still have spreadsheets. So all companies at some point in time use spreadsheets. So before performing any chromatographic calculations with a spreadsheet, let's remember the general considerations for calculations that Hannah mentioned earlier, and then answer this following question. Which of the general considerations are matched within a spreadsheet, like control access or other considerations that Hannah mentioned? Near none. It's hard to lock an Excel spreadsheet in a way that people cannot tamper with that. So it's a very complicated environment to work with. So I'm sure many of you are thinking that a case could be made of using validated spreadsheets. That might be true, assuming someone else doesn't unlock the sheets and manipulate calculations, which you would be surprised that it's incredibly easy to unlock an Excel spreadsheet. A couple of Google searches and you would find answers to that, and you could break that easily. So although it might be more comfortable and user-friendly to calculate results on a spreadsheet, because spreadsheets accept basically everything, it is definitely worth the effort to put those calculations within Empower. In addition to provide no access control for audit trails, an Excel spreadsheet doesn't provide those by default. A spreadsheet typically has manual data entries and permits an analyst, for example, to recalculate results before printing and saving the desired result values to the permanent batch record. So people could be cherry picking, putting values here and figuring out if that works for them, if this is a pass or fail. So you don't want that. One way of working with spreadsheets without really only relying on Excel and giving a coat of protection over that would be some LIMS and ELN systems permit analysts to embed spreadsheets within the system to overcome the security limitations and missing out the trail capabilities of desktop spreadsheets. So if there's no other way around spreadsheets and they need to be used, this approach of embedding your spreadsheets and putting intelligence over that and bringing that into an ELN and LIMS to give you the added layer of security would be the preferable way to deploy them. So to summarize this presentation, we wanted to leave you guys with those final thoughts. So data integrity must be considered from the very first moment and even precede the Empower calculation implementation. So if you get your data integrity requirements upfront evaluated from the config spec of your system up to the way you are ready to build the validations, that's the best way to go in terms of implementation of calculations, right? Always have data integrity from the get-go. So understand on paper first, where and how do you want to get your final calculated results? So understanding what a formula does and what are the results I'm going to get from there. On paper first, planning is the best way to figure out how you want to test that and what are your final results. So understand that on paper first, plan first before building the calculations. Measure the effort versus the benefits of including certain calculations in Empower in comparison with external systems, not only in terms of technical challenges, but also from a business perspective. So coming back again to that example of having a pass and fail custom field on Empower, that's doable and fairly easy to do. But the problem is Empower is not built, even though it has some tools to do this kind of evaluation, it's not meant for purpose, right? It's best designed for numeric calculations. And even though it's easy to do a pass and fail custom field, imagine having to build multiple pass and fail formulas for all your evaluations, like resolution or USP tailing or your percent over label claim, percent agreement. It can potentially double the number of custom fields you're creating for a specific test method. So that consumes times of development, validation, and so on and so on. Whereas you will have to address those pass and fail evaluations on an external system anyways, because you have pH meters in your lab, you have balances, you have NMR, you have GCs, you have a lot of other systems that might not be on Empower. So you will have to have a separate system anyways. So maybe the effort of building those calculations within Empower, you have to measure that if that's really too much beneficial in terms of what you get from that after that, right? And last but not least, once implemented, it is a live system in a regulated environment and must be treated as such. So once you build calculations, you test them, you validate, you create your validation documentation, and you're good to go. If changes happen to your test methods, you also have to take into consideration the calculations you built. So you don't end up with a method that altered for some reason, and then you have formulas that are giving you results that are not fit for purpose anymore, and you might have issues over that, right? So with that said, there are additional materials on the Astrix website regarding to Empower, such as case studies related to benefits brought by using Empower custom fields in a regulated environment. To check these and other great case studies, blogs and articles, you can go to astrixinc.com. And you can also visit our YouTube channel to check the webinars from previous months. Let's say you were invited for a webinar, but for some reason you weren't able to watch that. You can go to our YouTube channel and look into that, including there's a data integrity assessment webinar as well. So if you go to YouTube on Astrix Technology Group webinars, you can subscribe to our channel and you're gonna have access to all the previous presentations as well. So this is the place where you're gonna receive the link on next week for this record as well. So if you wanna check the past webinars, they're here for you right now. All right, and with that, I'll leave it up to Kevin.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was on mute there a second. So I wanted to go ahead and dig into the question a little bit. But first of all, thank you, obviously, for a great presentation. And again, thank you, everybody who joined and attended. I do want to encourage you all, if you haven't, to please ask questions. We're going to let the system kind of sit here for a minute or two while we hopefully gather some questions from some folks. And again, mention that we're going to go ahead and produce a recording of this. I'm going to go